The old man came to the corner of Marrowgate Square every morning at 9:15, and every morning he came a little slower. I know because I watched him from my post at the west gate of the palace, and a man who stands still for 6 hours a day learns to measure the world by the small things that move through it. The pigeons that lifted at the same church bell, the bread cart that rattled over the same loose cobble, and the old soldier in the gray coat who crossed the square from the direction of the almshouses, planted his cane on the flagstones, and lowered himself onto the third bench along the railing, as if he were lowering a flag at dusk, carefully, with a respect that had nothing to do with his knees. His name was Tomas Wind, though I did not learn that for a long while. He wore a coat that had once been good and was now only clean, and on the left breast of it he wore 3 medals that he polished himself, because you could see the difference between the shine a man gives his own honor and the shine a servant gives it. The ribbons were faded to the color of old wine. The metal caught the morning light. He sat under the bare plane trees and he watched the changing of the guard through the far railing, and when the drums came, he straightened his back by an inch that must have cost him a great deal, and he held it until the last man had passed. I am Corporal Adrin Voss of the King's Guard, and this is the story of the morning 3 young men decided that an old soldier on a bench was a thing to be laughed at, and of the seconds that followed, and of what justice looks like when it finally arrives. Not the slow, grinding kind that lives in ledgers, but the swift kind, the kind that comes with boots on stone and a name spoken aloud that changes the color of a man's whole afternoon. But I am ahead of myself. Let me put you where I was. The Palace of Harrowgate sits at the top of Marrowgate Square like a stern uncle at the head of a long table. Its gates are black iron chased with gold. Its forecourt is a field of pale gravel raked into lines. And along the front of it stand the sentries of the King's Guard in our red wool and our tall black bearskins, motionless as the stone lions on the plinths, while the whole restless business of the city flows past us. The tour groups with their raised phones, the clerks late for the ministries, the children dragging at their mothers' hands to point at the men who would not point back. We are not permitted to speak. We are not permitted to move except on command or in defense of the post and the persons we guard. A tourist may lean into your face and count the pores on your nose, and you will look through him as through glass. This is not arrogance. It is the oldest promise the uniform makes, that the man inside it has surrendered his own comfort, his own pride, his own right to answer a fool, in exchange for the right to be trusted absolutely when it matters. The stillness is not the point. The stillness is the price you pay in advance for the one moment when you are allowed to move, and in that moment you had better be right. I had stood the West Gate for 2 years by that autumn. I knew the square. I knew Tomas Wind, though we had never traded a word, the way you know a landmark. And on the morning this began, I knew, the way you know weather, that something was wrong in the square before I could have told you what. It was the boys. There were 3 of them, and I had seen their kind 100 times, young men with money enough for good boots and nothing at all to do with the hours God had given them. 2 were tall and 1 was broad, and they moved through the square the way a stone moves through a still pond, leaving a wake of turned heads and hurried steps. The broad one had a phone up, filming, always filming, as though a thing did not happen unless a lens confirmed it. They had been drinking, though it was not yet 10 in the morning, or they wanted the world to think they had, which comes to the same insolence. They came up the square laughing at nothing, and they might have passed on and out of my morning entirely, and this would be a different and shorter story. But the broad one's eye caught on the old man on the bench, on the medals, I think, on that little constellation of faded ribbon and honest metal, and he stopped, and he said something to the other 2, and they stopped as well. I could not hear it. I was 40 yards off behind the railing, at my post, and the wind was wrong. But I have learned to read a scene the way a sailor reads a sky, and I read this one at once, and every muscle in my body went from the stillness of discipline to the stillness of a drawn bow. They had found something to play with. The old man did not look up at first. He was watching the far side of the square, where in 20 minutes the relief guard would march, and his hands were folded on the head of his cane, and his face had the particular peace of a man who has come to the only place in his week that still feels like it belongs to him. He did not see them until the shadow of the broad one fell across his knees. Then he looked up, and I will tell you I saw no fear in it. That is the thing I remember most from the beginning of this. He looked up at these three strong young men the way you might look up at a rain cloud, with mild interest and no expectation of mercy, and no intention of running from it either. He had been rained on before. The broad one crouched down in front of him, easy, grinning, and pointed the phone at the metals. He said something and jerked his thumb, and the two tall ones laughed. One of them reached out and flicked the nearest metal with a fingernail, so it swung on its ribbon, and the old man's hand came up off the cane, not to strike, only to cover them, the way a man covers a wound, and that small protective motion made the boys laugh harder. 40 yards, a railing, a gate I could not leave. You must understand what a sentry's post is. It is not a suggestion. It is an oath rendered into geography. The man at the west gate does not leave the west gate to chase a pickpocket or break up a quarrel or comfort the weeping, because the moment he does, the gate is open, and everything the gate exists to protect is exposed. 100 honest impulses die at the edge of a sentry's post every day, and they must, or the post means nothing. I have stood and watched a woman drop her shopping and scramble after it into traffic, and I did not move because it was not the post's business, and the moving of me would have been a small betrayal of a very large trust. I will tell you what it costs, because no one ever does, and because it is the heart of what my uniform is, and the boys in the square could not have understood it if I had shouted it at them for an hour. It costs everything a decent man is made of. The whole animal in you, the part that has stood up for the weak since before there were words for it, screams at you to move, to cross the 40 yards, to put yourself between the old man and the cruelty, to do the one obvious human thing. And the discipline lays its cold hand on the back of your neck and says, "Not yet, not you, not now, the gate." And you obey, because you swore to, and because 100 men before you obeyed and kept the thing standing that your obedience keeps standing, and because the day a sentry decides his own heart outranks his post is the day the post is worth nothing. But do not imagine it costs nothing. I have carried that morning's 40 yards for years. I carry them now. My father was a soldier before me, a real one, not a ceremonial one. He served in the mountains in his day and came home quieter than he went, and he told me once, when I took the king's shilling, that the hardest order I would ever obey was the order to do nothing while my hands wanted to do something. He was right. He is usually right about the things he doesn't say much about. And on that gray morning in Marrowgate Square, with an old soldier's honor coming off his chest under a boy's fingernail, I obeyed the hardest order there is, and I have never been prouder and more ashamed of anything in the same breath. So I did the only two things a sentry can do. I fixed the scene in my memory, 3 young men, the broad one in the pale jacket filming, the 2 tall ones, the mockery of an old man's honor in a public square, and I signaled. There is a sergeant of the watch who walks the inner court, and there is a bell pull at the west gate that is not for tourists, and there is a way of shifting your weight and turning your eyes that another guardsman reads across a courtyard as clearly as a shout. I did all 3 in the space of a breath, and I trusted the machine I was part of to answer, because that is the other half of the oath. You hold your post, and you trust the men beside you to hold theirs, and between you the thing gets done. But the machine is not instant. The sergeant was on the far side of the inner court. The relief was still forming in the yard, and out in the square the game was getting worse. The broad one had straightened up now and was walking a slow circle around the bench, still filming, narrating to his lens in a voice I could just begin to catch on a gust. Look at this. Look at this old relic. And the two tall ones had taken up positions on either side of the old man, so that he sat hemmed, a small gray figure boxed by three grinning shadows. One of them snatched the cane, just plucked it out from under the old man's folded hands and held it up over his head, out of reach, and waggled it, and the old man made no lunge for it. He simply set his empty hands back in his lap and looked at the one who had taken it with an expression I have seen on the faces of men in the field when the shelling starts, and there is nothing to do but wait and keep your dignity. A terrible, patient stillness. He had decided, I think, to give them nothing. Not fear, not anger, not the satisfaction of a chase. He would sit, and he would let them tire of it, because he had waited out worse than 3 idle boys in a square. And that decision, that old soldier's decision to meet cruelty with composure, was the same decision my whole uniform is built on, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to break my post as I did watching him make it. The tall one tossed the cane, not to the old man, to the other tall one over his head, so it sailed the width of the bench, and the old man's eyes had to follow it up and across and down, and they laughed at that, at the way his neck had to work, and they threw it back the other way, and the old man sat in the middle of their game of catch like a stone in a stream and would not reach. The broad one crouched again, closer now, the phone almost in the old man's face. He said something, and the old man's jaw tightened the first crack in that composure, a small one. And then the broad one reached out with his free hand and set his fingers on the metals, and I understood, 40 yards off and helpless, that he meant to take them. That is when the square changed. Because a woman near the bread cart had stopped, and then another, and a clerk with a leather case had slowed, and a knot of tourists had drifted in with their own phones raised, and the thing that these boys had thought was a private amusement was becoming a public spectacle. But a spectacle of the worst kind, the kind where 30 people watch a wrong being done and not one of them steps into it, each waiting for another, each certain that surely someone official would come. And someone official was coming, but he had a gate to open first. The sergeant of the watch had read my signal. I saw him come out of the shadow of the inner arch at a fast walk that was not quite a run, because guardsmen do not run where the public can see us panic, and I saw him take in the square and the old man and the 3 boys, and I saw his hand go to the whistle at his collar. But between the inner arch and the west gate is a long stretch of raked gravel, and the sergeant was a big man past 50, and the boys were 40 yards beyond the gate, out in the open square where the palace's authority thins to almost nothing, where we are only men in costumes to those who do not know better. The broad one's fingers closed on the first medal. I did the calculation every guardsman does 100 times a shift and almost never acts on. The post, the oath, the gate at my back and the king's household behind it, and out there, an old soldier's honor being stripped from his chest by a boy who would put it on the internet before lunch. I had signaled. I had done my duty. No one could fault me for standing. No one but me. And then, before I moved, before the sergeant reached the gate, before the thing became the thing it became, a 4th figure came into the square, and everything I have told you was only the setting of the board. He came from the direction of the East Barracks, off duty, in the plain dark coat we wear when we are not in ceremonial dress, and I did not recognize him at first as one of ours because a king's guardsman out of his red and his bearskin is a strange, diminished thing, an ordinary man again. But I knew the walk. There is a walk the long-serving men have, a way of putting the feet down flat, and even that comes from 1,000 hours of standing, and I knew it, and then I knew the face, and my heart did something complicated in my chest. It was Sergeant Major Kestrel Hale. If you do not know that name, you did not serve in those years, and you are the poorer for it. Kestrel Hale had 30 years in when I was a recruit trembling in the drill yard, and he had earned in his time the highest thing our service gives, the Cross of Valor, for a night on a mountain border I was never told the whole of, and he wore it on his dress tunic on the great days, and on ordinary days he carried it, they said, in the breast pocket over his heart. He was the man they brought young guardsmen to when the young guardsmen had forgotten what the uniform was for. He was, by that autumn, near the end of his service and moved to lighter duties, and he crossed Marrowgate Square most mornings on his way to the Veterans' Hall where he took his tea, and I had seen him a dozen times and never once seen him hurry. He was not hurrying now. That is the thing I want you to understand about what came next. He did not break into a run. He did not shout. He saw the whole of it, the boxed old man, the swinging cane, the broad boy's fingers on the metals, the 30 cowards watching, and he changed his course by perhaps 10 degrees, and he came on at the same flat, even, unhurried pace, and somehow that was more frightening than any charge could have been. It was the pace of a man who has decided how a thing will end and is merely walking toward the ending. The broad one had the first medal half off its pin now. The old man had stopped watching the cane. He was watching the broad one's hand at his chest, and his face had gone very still and very pale, and I saw his lips move, and though I could not hear it I have thought since that I know what he said, because it is what men of his generation say when the thing they cannot bear is happening. Please. Not to the boy, to no one, to the morning. The broad one heard it and grinned wider, and said something to the lens. And Kestrel Hale arrived. He did not touch anyone. This is important, and it is the first lesson of the man, and it is a lesson the boys were about to learn at some cost. He did not lay a hand on the broad one or shove the tall ones aside. He simply stepped into the small space at the end of the bench, into the exact place a fourth shadow would fall, and he stood there in his plain dark coat with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at the broad one with the medal in his fingers, and he said one word. I could hear it now. The square had gone quieter, the way a room goes quiet when a large dog walks into it, and the word carried. Stop it. That was all. No title, no threat, no speech. And the broad one, who a moment before had been narrating his own cleverness to a phone, looked up into the face of Kestrel Hale, and the grin came off him like paint off a wall in the rain. Because whatever else those boys were, they were not blind, and there are some faces the animal in a man reads before the mind has caught up, the face of someone who is not afraid of you, who has never in his life been afraid of the likes of you, and who has stepped into your morning not to argue but to end it. Hale had that face. He had earned it on a mountain a long time before these boys were born, and he wore it now over an old man's medals, and the broad one's hand came off the old man's chest as though the medal had gone hot. The two tall ones recovered first, because it is always the followers who are bravest when they have not yet understood the odds. One of them, the one holding the cane, laughed a high, uncertain thing and said, "Walk on, Grandad, this isn't your business." And Hale turned his head slowly and looked at him, and did not say anything at all. I have been on the receiving end of that look exactly once, and I will tell you it is worse than any words. It is the look of a man taking your measure and finding you very small. The tall one's laugh died in his throat. "Give the man his cane," Hale said, quietly, as though it were the most reasonable thing in the world, which it was. The tall one did not give the man his cane. Instead, he did the thing that idle young men do when they feel a situation slipping and cannot bear it. He made it louder. He turned to the small crowd that had gathered by the bread cart and the railing, and he spread his arms, playing to them, appealing to them, as though the 30 strangers were a jury he could win. "You all seeing this? Some old bloke thinks he can tell us what to do. We're just having a laugh. No harm in it. Right?" And he grinned around at the faces, waiting for them to laugh with him, to make it a joke again, to give him back the morning. Not one of them laughed. That was the moment, I think, that the boys first felt the ground change under them. The moment the audience they had been performing for turned out not to be an audience at all, but witnesses. A woman near the cart said clearly, "Leave him be." A man in a clerk's coat said, "That's a veteran, you fool." The tall one's grin faltered and slid, and he turned back to Hale with the ugliness that comes up in a certain kind of young man the instant the world stops finding him charming. "Old man," he said, and his voice had lost its play, "I'm telling you one time, walk away." Hale did not walk away. He had not moved at all, in fact, since he stopped at the end of the bench. He stood with his hands loose and his weight easy, and he let the tall one's threat hang in the air and die there, unanswered, which is the most contemptuous thing you can do to a threat. "Give the man his cane," he said again, exactly as before. Same words, same evenness. And there was something in that repetition, that refusal to escalate to match them, that unsettled the boys far more than shouting would have. They were used to a world that shouted back, that could be pushed and pulled and provoked. Here was a man who simply would not be moved from a single reasonable sentence, and they did not know what to do with him. "Or what?" said the other tall one. And there it was, the question that reveals everything, the question a fool asks, and a wise man never needs answered. Hale did not tell him or what. He did something better. He reached into the breast of his plain dark coat, unhurried, and he drew out a small leather folder, and he opened it and held it up, not high, not theatrically, just level with the boy's face. And in it was the warrant card of the King's Guard, and above the card, pinned to the leather, catching the gray morning light, was a small dark cross on a crimson ribbon that even those boys, ignorant as they were, had seen enough times on enough solemn broadcasts to half recognize. "My name is Sergeant Major Hale of the King's Guard," he said, in the same quiet, even voice. "This is a decorated soldier of the realm you have been amusing yourselves with. And there is a man at that gate. He did not look at me. He knew exactly where I was. He had clocked my signal from across the square the moment he entered it, who has already called the watch. So, you have about 30 seconds to become the sort of young men who help an old soldier to his feet before you become the sort we take through the far door of a station. Choose quickly. I want to freeze the square here, because it is the pivot of the whole morning, and everything I have told you was walking toward it. 30 people watching. 3 boys with the wind gone out of them, an old man on a bench with his hand over his medals, a sergeant of the watch coming through the west gate at last with 2 guardsmen behind him. And in the center of it, one off-duty soldier in a plain coat who had not raised his voice or his hand, holding up a card and a cross, betting his whole dignity on the proposition that honor, plainly stated, would be enough. It was not quite enough. Not yet, because the broad one, the filmer, the leader, the one who had reached for another man's medals, was not the sort to be beaten by a quiet word, and pride is the last thing to leave a fool. He put his phone away. He drew himself up, and he made the worst decision of his young life. He shoved Kestrel Hale. 2 hands flat to the chest, the way boys shove in a schoolyard, meaning to move the old man out of his space and re-establish the pecking order of the square. It was a stupid thing to do to anyone. It was a catastrophically stupid thing to do to a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how bodies move and exactly how little effort it takes to unmake them. Hale did not fall. That was the first surprise for the broad one, that a shove which would have sat a normal man on the cobbles moved this one perhaps 2 inches, because he had already, without any of us seeing him do it, set his feet the way you set your feet when you have decided a thing is coming. The shove landed against a wall. And then Hale moved for the first time. I have watched a great deal of violence in my life, most of it clumsy, and I want to tell you that what Hale did was not violence in the way the boys understood the word. There was no punch. There was no strike a camera could have made ugly. He simply took the broad one's shoving wrist as it recoiled, turned it a small precise amount in a direction wrists do not wish to go, stepped in past the boy's shoulder, and used the boy's own momentum and his own settled weight to fold him down onto one knee on the flagstones as gently and as inescapably as a man closing a book. The broad one went down with a yelp that was more astonishment than pain. And there he stayed, one knee on the cold stone, his arm held up behind him in a lock he could not begin to break, and above him Kestrel Hale stood exactly as unhurried as before, not even breathing hard, holding him there with what looked, to the 30 watchers, like no effort at all, because that is what 30 years buys you, the ability to make the extraordinary look like nothing. I said stop, Hale told him quietly down to the top of his head. You should have stopped. The two tall ones froze. One still held the cane, absurdly, up in the air where he had been playing catch with a soldier's dignity, and now he did not know what to do with it, and he looked at it as though it had appeared in his hand by witchcraft. And that is when the sergeant of the watch arrived, with 2 guardsmen at his heels, Corporal Byan and young Tam Ately, both good men, and the last of the boy's world came apart. Because now there was no ambiguity, no question of whether the man in the plain coat had any right. Here was the red wool. Here were the bearskins. Here were the King's Guard, come through the west gate into the square, and the thing the boys had thought was a joke against a helpless old man was revealed for what it was. An assault in public, with a confession filmed on the assailant's own phone, upon a decorated veteran of the realm, in front of the household of the king. "Sergeant Major," said the sergeant of the watch, coming up, and there was a great deal in the way he said it, respect and relief, and the beginning of an enormous administrative satisfaction. "You'll be all right to release him to us." "Gladly," said Hale. He let the boy's arm go and stepped back, and the broad one stayed on his knee a moment longer than he needed to, the way a man does when he is deciding whether his legs will obey him. Then he got up. And the fight was gone out of him entirely, and out of all 3 of them, because the arithmetic of the square had changed, and even they could add. But Hale was not finished, and here is where the story turns from a scuffle into the thing I have carried with me since. He did not gloat. He did not lecture. He turned his back on the 3 boys entirely, the surest possible sign of what he thought of the danger they posed, and he went to the old man on the bench. And he knelt. Kestrel Hale, cross of valor, 30 years of service, went down on one knee in front of Tomas Wend on the cold flagstones of Marrowgate Square, so that his eyes were below the old man's, and he took the cane out of the tall boy's slack hand without looking at him, and laid it across the old man's knees where it belonged, and he did the thing that broke the square open. He reached out carefully, and he set the swinging metal, the one the broad one had half torn from its pin, back into its place on the old man's chest, and with the ball of his thumb he pressed it flat and true, and he smoothed the faded ribbon, the way you would settle a decoration on a comrade before an inspection. "There now," he said, not to the crowd, to the old man. "There. All present and correct." And Tomas Wend, who had not shown fear to 3 young men mocking him, who had sat like a stone in their stream and given them nothing, Tomas Wend put his hand over his medals, over Hale's hand where it still rested for a moment against his chest, and his face, which had been so still, came apart all at once the way old men's faces do, into something that was not weeping exactly but was very close to it, and he said, in a voice I could hear now because the square had gone entirely silent, "Thank you, soldier." "No," said Hale. "Thank asterisk you asterisk, I saw your ribbons. 5th of the line, weren't you, the ridge?" The old man's eyes widened. "You know it." "I know it," Hale said. "Everyone who came after you knows it. You held that ridge so that men like me had a country to be born into." He stood slowly, his knees no younger than the old man's, and he came up to his full height, and he did a thing then that I have seen 1,000 times on the parade ground and never once seen mean so much. He stepped back 1 pace, and he brought his boots together, and he raised his hand, and he saluted Tomas Wend, a private of the line, retired, sitting on a bench in a gray coat, with the full formal salute of the King's Guard, held long, held perfectly, in the middle of a public square in front of 30 people and 3 shamed boys, and the whole in different mourning. The crowd did not applaud. It was not that kind of moment. But I saw a woman by the bread cart put her hand to her mouth, and I saw the clerk with the leather case take off his hat, quietly, the way you do at a graveside, and I saw one of the tourists lower his phone, because some things you understand you should not be filming. And I saw the three boys standing at the edge of it, forgotten, unsaluted, unthanked, watching an old man they had thought was nothing receive from a great soldier the honor they would never in their lives be given. And I saw the first true understanding of what they had done come into their faces, and it was worse for them than any blow. I thought, watching from my post, that the story was over. A wrong done, a wrong answered, a salute given. The sergeant of the watch would take the three boys' names. They would spend an uncomfortable hour in a station giving accounts, and by evening it would be a tale I told the other men in the guardroom. I did not yet know that the morning had a longer reach than that, and that the broad boy in the pale jacket was not merely a fool, but a fool with a name that would make the next 3 days considerably more interesting than any of us expected. Here is how I learned it. The relief came at last, and I was stood down, and because I had made the signal and witnessed the whole of it from the beginning, I was called into the guardroom to give my account to the officer of the day, Captain Marrow, a lean and careful man who wrote everything twice and believed nothing until it was corroborated. I gave it plainly: the three young men, the mockery, the medals, the cane, the arrival of Sergeant Major Hale, the shove, the lock, the salute. Marrow wrote it down. Then he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I could not read. "You're certain of the broad one, pale jacket, filming?" "Certain, sir. He led it. He had his hand on the medals." Marrow was quiet a moment. Then he said, "His name is Denning, Fabian Denning." I did not know the name and said so. "You wouldn't," said Marrow, "but his father is Lord Corvin Denning, who sits on the Palace Committee for the Civil List, and is, at this exact moment, in a meeting 3 floors above us deciding the Guards' budget for next year." He picked his pen back up. "So this is now a somewhat delicate morning, Corporal. Because a decorated veteran was assaulted in a public square, and the man who set it to rights is one of ours, and the young man in the lock is the son of one of the most powerful officials in this building. And there are already, I am told, 2 versions of the video circulating." "That stopped me, too, sir." "The one on the boy's phone," said Marrow, "which shows the whole of it, including the mockery and the assault, and which is currently in the hands of the watch. And a second one, shorter, which appeared on the network an hour ago, filmed by one of the boy's friends from behind, and which begins precisely at the moment Sergeant Major Hale takes the young man's wrist. It shows an old man in a plain coat throwing a well-dressed youth to the ground in a public square. Nothing before it, nothing of the medals or the mockery, just that." He set the pen down again. "It is captioned, I'm told, 'Off-duty guard assaults innocent young man over nothing.' It has been shared some 40,000 times since breakfast." I felt the whole shape of the morning change under me. This is the thing they do not teach you when they teach you to stand still, that the truth is not self-defending, that a wrong plainly seen by 30 people can be turned, in an hour, into its own opposite by a man who controls where the story starts. Begin the tape at the shove and Hale is a bully. Begin it at the medals and he is a hero. The same seconds, the same square, and everything depended on who held the beginning. "Sergeant Major Hale," I said carefully. "Is he?" "Suspended," said Marrow, "pending inquiry, as of 40 minutes ago, on the complaint of Lord Denning, whose son, it emerges, has a bruised wrist and a great deal to say about it." He saw my face and his own hardened, not at me. "I don't like it either, Corporal, but that is the machine, and the machine has been aimed at a good man by someone who knows exactly which levers to pull. Your account matters. The old man's account matters. And the full video matters most of all, if it survives contact with a committee that would very much prefer it didn't." I left the guardroom sick to my stomach, and I did the only thing I could think to do, which was to find out about Tomas Wend, because it seemed to me that a man about to be reduced to a caption deserved to be known first as a man. He had been taken kindly to the Veterans Hall off the square, the very place Hale went for his tea, and it was there, while Hale himself sat suspended and silent in a back room, forbidden to speak of the case, that I sat with the old man over a cup he could not quite hold steady, and he told me in pieces who he was. Tomas Wend had been 18 years old on the ridge. That is the thing you must hold on to when you look at the gray coat, and the cane and the medals faded to old wine, that once he was younger than the boys who mocked him, and he had stood on a stony spur of high ground with the fifth of the line, while a very great deal of the world tried to come over it, and he had not come down. The 3 medals were for 3 days I will not describe, because he did not describe them. He was not a man who traded in the currency of his own suffering. He said only that of the men who went up the ridge with him, a little more than a third came down, and that he had spent 60 years since then trying to be worth the ones who did not, and that he came to Marrowgate Square each morning because watching the young guard march past reminded him that the country he had held was still there, still standing, still worth the ridge. He told me about a man named Collie. He had not, he said, spoken the name aloud in years, but it came up out of him in that warm hall over the cooling tea as though it had only been waiting. Collie had been 19, a farmer's son, and he had shared the old man's stretch of the ridge on the second night, and when the ammunition ran low, it was Collie who had crawled down the forward slope in the dark to strip the pouches from the fallen and crawl back, 3 times, 4 times, more times than any order could have required, because the men on the ridge would need every round when the light came. On the 4th crawl he had not come back. And in the morning, when the light came and the attack came with it, the men on the ridge had fought it off with the rounds Collie had carried up in the dark, and Tomas Wend had lived, and Collie had not, and that, the old man said, pressing the medal with his thumb, that was what the medal on his chest was. It was not a decoration. It was a debt. It was Collie and the others carried on the breast of the one who came down, so that when strangers looked at an old man on a bench they might, if they were the right kind of stranger, remember for 1/2 a second that the ground they stood on had been held, and by whom, and at what. You see why I couldn't chase the cane, he said. A man doesn't scramble for a stick while he's wearing them. It would have been undignified isn't the word. It would have been a lie about what they are. So I sat. I let the boys have their game. I've sat still under worse than boys. He almost smiled. The trick of the ridge, Corporal, was the same trick as your gait. You want to run and you don't. You hold because holding is the job, and because the men beside you are holding, and because if you break, the whole line breaks. I held the ridge for 3 days by not running. I could hold a bench for 3 boys by not reaching. It's the same muscle. You know it. You use it every morning at that gate. I said I did, and that I had used it that very morning, watching, and that I was not proud of the using. He looked at me a long moment. No, he said, you wouldn't be. That's how I know you're the right kind. The wrong kind hold their post and feel nothing. You held yours and it half killed you. Hold on to that half killing, son. It's the thing that'll tell you one day when the order to hold has become the order to be a coward. They're different orders. They wear the same coat. The whole of your training is learning to tell them apart in the half-second you're given. He set down his cup. That soldier this morning, the one in the dark coat, he could tell them apart. That's all courage is in the end, not fearlessness, telling the 2 orders apart and obeying the right one in the half-second. I don't mind the boys, he told me then, and his hand shook on the cup. I've been young and stupid. Stupid grows out mostly. What I minded, he stopped and looked at his medals and pressed the swinging one with his thumb the way Hale had done. What I minded was the hand on these, because these aren't mine. Do you see? They're theirs, the ones on the ridge, Collie's. I only carry them. And when that boy put his hand on them to take them, it was them he was taking. That's what I couldn't. He could not finish it and did not need to. I told him then what Marrow had told me. About the second video. About Hale suspended. About the son of Lord Denning and the great machine turning to grind a good man small. I watched it land in his face, and I watched something come up in the old man that I had not seen in the square. Not fear, not sorrow, but a slow, cold anger. The anger of a man who has spent his whole life being told to sit down and take it, and has decided that this once, for someone else, he will not. They suspended the man who helped me, he said. Yes. On the word of the boy who, he set the cup down, very carefully, so as not to break it because he was a man who did not break things even when his hands wanted to. Corporal Voss. I have not asked anyone for anything in 60 years. I did not ask for the almshouse, they gave it to me. I did not ask to be thanked, a man doesn't, but I will ask for this. Take me to whoever decides. I was there, I saw all of it. That soldier put himself between me and 3 strong young men, and he never so much as raised his voice until one of them laid hands on him. And if my word is worth anything at all in this country, I held. His voice cracked, and he mastered it. Then I will spend it, all of it, on him. Before I take you across the square with the old man, I must tell you 2 more things about that long gray afternoon, because they are the things that turned a scuffle into a reckoning, and because I have never been able to think of one without the other. The first is what happened to the video. I had thought in my innocence that the truth would look after itself. 30 people had watched 3 boys torment an old soldier, and a good man said it right. How could that be turned? I learned that afternoon exactly how, and it is a thing every young man should be made to learn before he trusts the world too far. By the time I sat with Thomas Wend over his shaking cup of tea, the short video, the edited one, the one that began at Fabian Denning's own shove and cut away all that came before it, had been shared past 40,000 and was climbing toward 100. And it did not climb quietly. It gathered a chorus. Strangers who had not been within a mile of Marrowgate Square that morning wrote beneath it in tones of great certainty that this was what the Guard had become: thugs in costume, bullies with a license, an old brute in a coat throwing a boy to the cobbles for the crime of youth. Someone had found Hale's name. Someone had found his age. Someone had written, and it was shared 10,000 times, "This is why we shouldn't let old men who think they're still soldiers walk around loose." An old man who had held a ridge, called a danger to the public, by people who had never held anything heavier than a phone. I watched Thomas Wend read a little of it over my shoulder. I had not meant him to, but he was quicker than his years, and I watched his face, and I will tell you it did not crumple. It hardened. "They've got it backwards," he said quietly. "That's not carelessness. Someone did that. Someone sat down and chose where to start the picture." He set his cup down. "I've seen men do that with a battle report. Started after the order that lost the ground, and the man who was told to hold looks like a coward. It's the oldest lie there is. It's not even a lie quite. Every second of it is true. It's just the true seconds arranged to say a false thing." He looked at me. "Who benefits, Corporal? Always ask who benefits." I did not have to ask. Marrow had already told me. The boy with the medals in his hand had a father 3 floors up who set the Guard's budget, and the father had a secretary. And the secretary knew, as such men always know, that a country's attention is a shallow thing that drinks the first version it is handed and rarely troubles to swallow the second. Cut the tape at the shove, feed it out fast, attach a father's outrage, and by the time the true tape surfaced, if it surfaced, the country would have already decided, and deciding again is the hardest thing a crowd ever does. That was the machine, and that was the first thing. The second thing was smaller and, in its way, worse, and it is the reason I came to believe that Thomas Wend was a braver man at 82 than most men are at any age. While we sat in the Veterans Hall, a young man came in. Not one of the 3, a 4th, one of the friends, the one who I would later learn had filmed the short video from behind. He was perhaps 20, well-dressed, and he came in with the particular swagger of someone sent on an errand he thinks is clever. He found us at the table by the window. He did not sit. He stood over the old man, the way the boys had stood over him in the square that morning, and he said, in a low, reasonable voice that was more frightening than any shout, that he understood the old gentleman was thinking of making trouble, and that he wanted to be sure the old gentleman understood how these things went, that Fabian's family were not people you made trouble for, that there were lawyers, that an old man on a pension in an almshouse had a great deal to lose and nothing to gain, and that the sensible thing, the dignified thing, would be to let the young men and the guards sort it out between themselves and go home and forget he'd been in the square at all. I began to rise. Tomas Wynn put his hand on my arm. "Sit down, Corporal," he said, without taking his eyes off the young man. And then to the boy in a voice as level as a floor, "You've come to frighten me. I've come to advise you." "You've come to frighten me," the old man said again. "And I want you to understand something, son, because you're young and you've been told the world runs on fear and you half believe it. I was 18 years old on a ridge that a great many strong young men wanted to take from me, and they came up it in the dark with more than lawyers, and I did not go home and forget I'd been there. So you may tell whoever sent you that I have been frightened by professionals and survived it, and that there is nothing you or Fabian's father or Fabian's father's lawyers can take from an 82-year-old man that the years aren't already taking and taking faster. I have my word. I saw what I saw, and I am going to spend my word in full in the light. Tomorrow morning is too late, this afternoon, and there is not one thing your low voice can do about it." He leaned forward on his cane. "Now go and tell them that. Go on. Errand's done." The young man's reasonable face did something ugly, and then something frightened, and then he went, and he did not come back, and I understood that I had just watched an old soldier win a second engagement that same day without lifting anything heavier than his own courage. When the door had closed behind him, Tomas Wynn's hand, which had been so steady on my arm, began to shake again, and I saw the cost of that steadiness, and I loved him for it. "I'm tired, Corporal," he admitted, very low. "God, I'm tired, but I'll not be handled, and I'll not let them handle that soldier. Take me across the square." And that is how it came to be that an 82-year-old private of the line, leaning on the cane the boys had thrown, walked back across Marrowgate Square that same afternoon and asked, at the west gate, my gate, to be admitted to the palace of Harrogate to give evidence for a soldier who had knelt to him. And that is where the second half of this story begins. I was not supposed to leave my post to escort him, and I did not. But my shift had ended, and a man off duty may walk where he likes, and so I walked beside Tomas Wynn the length of the square in the failing light of the afternoon, matching my pace to his, and I brought him not to the west gate where the tourists queued, but to the visitors' hall on the north side where the officer of the day received formal callers, and I gave his name and his purpose to the clerk, and I watched the clerk's face do something careful when I said the word evidence. We were made to wait. That is the first weapon of the machine, the wait. A great cold room with hard chairs, and an hour, and then another, and the light dying in the tall windows, and an old man who had been mocked and manhandled that same morning sitting bolt upright because he would not let them see him tired. I fetched him water. I did not leave him. And I understood, as the hours went, that we were being managed, that somewhere above us a decision was being shaped, and that the shaping would go better for certain people if the old soldier gave up and went home before he could be heard. He did not give up. I have not before or since seen such stubbornness in a frail body. Every time the clerk came to suggest, gently, that perhaps the matter would be better handled in writing in the morning through the proper channels, Tomas Wynn said the same thing. "I'll wait. I've waited longer for worse." And he folded his hands on the cane and looked at the door. At last, near evening, a man came for us who was not the clerk. He was tall and smooth and beautifully dressed, and he introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Farr, secretary to the palace committee, and he had the particular warmth of a man whose warmth is a tool. He sat down across from us and folded his hands and told us how sorry everyone was about the unpleasantness in the square, and how seriously the matter was being taken, and how important it was that these things be handled fairly. And he leaned on the word, so that no one on either side was rushed to judgment. "On either side," said Tomas Wynn. "On either side," Mr. Farr agreed, smiling. You must understand, sir, that a young man was injured, that there is video, that there are strong feelings and a family involved, and that Sergeant Major Hale, distinguished as his record is, did lay hands on a member of the public. These things must be weighed. I'm sure a man of your service understands the importance of due process. I watched the old man's face, and I saw him understand exactly what Mr. Farr was. The machine, wearing its kindest coat, come to weigh a soldier's honor against a lord's son's bruised wrist, and let us know, gently, which way the scales were built to fall. Let me be sure I have it, said Thomas Wen slowly. There is a video, the short one, the one that starts after. Mr. Farr's smile flickered. There are 2 videos, sir. But the one that's been shared 40,000 times is the short one, the one that starts after the mockery, after the hand on my medals. The old man leaned forward on his cane. So the question isn't whether it happened. 30 people saw it happen. The question is which part of it the country gets to see. And you've come down here, Mr. Farr, in your good coat, to make sure the answer is the part where an old soldier's champion looks like a brute. He sat back. I'm 82. I held a ridge. I have buried nearly everyone I ever loved, and I have watched this country grow careless and forget what it cost, and I have never once complained because complaining is not what we did. But I will not sit here and be handled while a good man is fed to a committee to save a fool from his father's embarrassment. So you take me to whoever is above you, and if he is a coward too, you take me to whoever is above him. I have all night. I have, God help me, all the nights that are left. There was a silence in that cold room. Mr. Farr's smooth face worked. And I thought we had lost. I thought he would rise and make his excuses and leave us to the dark and the hard chairs and the slow smothering of the truth, when the door at the far end of the hall opened, and a woman came through it, and everyone in the room stood up at once, including Mr. Farr, so fast he knocked his chair. I knew her. Everyone in the realm knew her. It was Princess Adela, the king's sister, who had for years been the household's fiercest defender of the guard and the plainest speaker in a family famous for its diplomacy. She was not supposed to be in the visitors' hall. She was, I would learn, not supposed to know about any of this at all. The whole matter had been kept carefully within the committee, away from the family, precisely because the family had a habit of taking the guard's side. But Princess Adela had a habit of her own, which was of hearing things she was not meant to hear, and one of the guardsmen, young Tam Ately, who had helped take the boys that morning and could not stomach what he heard being done to Hale, had gone to her equerry with the truth, and she had come down herself. She crossed the hall, and she did not look at Mr. Farr, and she stopped in front of Thomas Wend, and she looked at the medals on his gray coat, and then she did the thing that undid the old man completely. She inclined her head to him, a small, real bow from a princess of the realm to a private of the line, and she said, "The 5th of the line, the ridge. I read your citation when I was a girl, sir. My grandfather kept it framed." Thomas Wen tried to stand and could not, and she put her hand on his shoulder to keep him seated, and she said, "Number sit. You've done enough standing today, I'm told. Now, I want you to tell me everything that happened in the square this morning, from the beginning, from the true beginning. And I want Mr. Farr to stay and hear it, because Mr. Farr and I are going to have a conversation afterward about how a decorated soldier of this household came to be suspended before anyone in my family was even informed." Mr. Farr sat back down. He did not look well. And Thomas Wen told her everything. The bench, the boys, the mockery, the cane, the hand on his medals. The word please he had said to no one, and the plain dark coat coming across the square at that flat, even, terrible pace, and the one word stop, and the card and the cross held up, and the shove, and the lock that was not a blow, and the salute. He told it plainly and without a single flourish, an old soldier's report, and when he came to the salute his voice went, and Princess Adela waited, quite still, until he could go on, and no one in that room breathed. When he was done she was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Mr. Farr and said, in a voice with all the warmth gone out of it, "There is a video that begins at the shove." "Yes, ma'am." "And a video that begins at the medals." "Yes, ma'am." "And the committee has been shown the first and not the second." Mr. Farr said nothing, which was answer enough. "Bring me both," said Princess Adela. "Tonight. Bring me both, and bring me Sergeant Major Hale, who is to be treated as an honored guest of this household and not a suspect from this moment, and bring me Lord Denning, who I think will find the next hour educational. And Mr. Farr," she paused at the door, "the next time someone tries to teach my family's guard that honor is a thing that can be edited, I would like to hear about it before it has been shared 40,000 times, not after. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly, ma'am," said Mr. Farr in a very small voice. She left, and Thomas Wen sat in the hard chair in the cold hall with his hand over his medals, and he looked at me, and he said in wonder, "She read my citation." "She did, sir. When she was a girl." He shook his head slowly. "All these years I thought no one remembered the ridge." "They remembered, sir," I said. "You just hadn't met the ones who did." What happened that night I did not see all of, and what I did not see I have from Tam Ately, who stood the inner door, and from Hale himself, long afterward in the guardroom over a cup of the tea he liked. But I can put it together for you, and it is worth putting together, because it is the part where justice, the swift, lawful, fitting kind, finally arrived. They gathered in a small oak-paneled room off the state corridor, the kind of room where the household settles the things that must be settled quietly. Princess Adela, the officer of the day, Captain Marrow, a magistrate of the crown named Fenwick, sent for at speed, Lord Corvin Denning, summoned from his budget meeting and arriving red-faced and full of grievance, and his son, Fabian Denning, of the pale jacket and the bruised wrist, who came in expecting, I think, to be comforted, and found instead a room that had already seen the whole of the truth. Because they had both videos now, and they watched them both in order on a screen at the end of the room. The short one first, the one the country had seen, the one that began at the shove and made Hale a brute. Lord Denning nodded through it, satisfied, building his case. "There," he said, "you see, an old man throwing my son to the ground, unprovoked." "Now the other," said Princess Adela. And they watched the long one. The one from the broad boy's own phone, seized by the watch, which began where the morning began, with 3 young men closing on an old soldier on a bench, and the flick of a fingernail against a metal, and the cane snatched and thrown again over the old man's head, and the phone pushed into his face, and the narration, "Look at this old relic," in Fabian Denning's own voice, recorded by Fabian Denning's own hand, and then the fingers closing on the medals to tear them free, and only then. Only after all of it, the plain dark coat arriving and the one word and the shove, Fabian's shove, and the lock that answered it. The room was very quiet when it ended. I have the next part from Tam Ately, who stood the inner door with his eyes forward and missed nothing, and who told it to me that night in the guardroom with a kind of wonder still on him. He said the worst part was Fabian Denning's face while the long video played. Not shame. That would have been something. That would have been the beginning of a man. What crossed the boy's face, Tam said, was calculation. You could watch him watching himself commit each offense and searching, frame by frame, for the excuse, the angle, the version he could tell his father that would still, somehow, make it someone else's fault. And when the tape reached the fingernail flicking the metal, and the old man's hand coming up to cover his own honor, and Fabian's own voice on the recording saying, "Look at this old relic," even then the boy's mouth had opened to explain it, and it was his father, Tam said, and not the magistrate, who told him to be quiet. "Don't," Lord Denning had said, very low. "Don't say one more word." Because the father, whatever else he was, had spent a life reading rooms, and he had just read this one, and he understood that his son's every further word was another shovelful out of the hole. There was a moment, Tam swore to it, when Lord Denning looked at his son, and something like grief moved over him. The grief of a man discovering all at once what his money and his committees and his fixing of small consequences had built. A boy who had never once, in 20 years, met a wall his father could not knock down for him. A boy who had reached for an old soldier's medals in a public square because it had never occurred to him, not for 1 second, that anything he did could cost him anything at all. Lord Denning had made that boy as surely as he had fathered him, and he sat in the oak room and watched the making play back on a screen, and Tam said the man aged 5 years in the space of the film. Magistrate Fenwick spoke first, because it was his place to. "I have seen enough to be clear on the law," he said. "The second video establishes the sequence beyond any doubt. Sergeant Major Hale intervened, verbally and lawfully, to prevent an ongoing assault and theft upon an elderly man. He identified himself. He gave the young men the opportunity to desist. He used no force until he was himself assaulted. That shove is plainly visible, and the force he then used was the minimum necessary to restrain a violent young man and was released the instant help arrived. There is no case against him. There was never a case against him. The suspension was procured on a partial and misleading record." "My son," began Lord Denning, "was—" "Your son," said Fenwick, "assaulted a decorated veteran, committed theft, assaulted a king's guardsman, and recorded his own commission of all 3. The only reason he is not already in a cell is the courtesy of this household in hearing the matter privately. That courtesy, my lord, is nearly exhausted." I am told Lord Denning went from red to white in the space of a breath, because a man who has spent his life on committees knows the exact sound of a door closing, and he had just heard it. He turned to his son, and whatever he saw in the boy's face, the sullenness, the total absence of remorse, the expectation still that his father would fix it, seemed to finish something in him. He had come into the room to protect his son from consequence. He understood now, too late, that the consequence had been his son's own doing, filmed by his son's own hand, and that no amount of committeecraft could edit a country's memory back to what it had been at breakfast, because the long video was out now too. Tam Ately had seen to that quietly, the moment he understood what was being done, and 40,000 shares of the lie were being overtaken, hour by hour, by the truth. Princess Adela let the silence hold. Then she said to the boy directly, "You will apologize to Private Wend, in person, and it will be a true one, or you will find yourself explaining to a magistrate why it wasn't. You will do a year of service at the Veterans Hall on the square, you will fetch and carry and listen, and you will learn what those ribbons cost that you thought were a toy. Your 2 friends will do the same, and the video you made, your video, the true one, will be kept and shown wherever it is useful to teach young men what happens when they mistake an old soldier for a thing to laugh at." She looked at Lord Denning. "And you, my lord, will resign from the committee that sets my family's guards budget, because a man who tried to break one of our guards to spare his son a blush cannot be trusted to weigh their worth in coin. You may keep your seat in the other place." "You will not keep that one." Lord Denning opened his mouth and closed it and bowed, because there was nothing else left to do. And then Sergeant Major Kestrel Hale was brought in. He came in still in the plain dark coat, still suspended as far as he knew, expecting, I think, the worst, because a man who has served 30 years knows how these things usually go for the man at the bottom when a lord is at the top. He stood at attention in the middle of the oak room and waited to be told he was finished. Instead, Princess Adela crossed to him and she said, "Sergeant Major, on behalf of my family, I owe you an apology, and I would rather owe you a thanks. Your suspension is lifted, effective this moment, and struck from your record as if it had never been. And there is a man in the visitors' hall who has been waiting all evening to see you cleared, and who will not go home until he has. I think you should go to him." Hale's composure held, it always held, but I am told his eyes did something once, and he said only, "Ma'am, thank you, ma'am." And he asked one thing, the only thing he asked in that whole room. The old soldier, Private Wend, Is he all right?" "Go and see," said the princess. "That is an order I think you'll enjoy obeying." He came down the state corridor and into the cold visitors' hall where Thomas Wind and I had waited the whole of that long evening, and I was there, and I saw it. The old man looked up and saw Hale coming toward him out of uniform and uncondemned, cleared, restored, and Thomas Wind got to his feet. He would not receive this sitting down, whatever it cost his knees, and he leaned on the cane the boys had thrown, and the two soldiers stood facing each other in the empty hall, the old and the not-so-old, 60 years and one terrible ridge between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment because neither of them was a man who traded in words. Then Thomas Wind straightened as far as his back would let him, and he raised his hand, and he returned the salute Hale had given him that morning in the square, a private of the line saluting a sergeant major, honor answering honor, and Hale came to attention and returned it, and the two of them held it there in the lamplight, and I stood at the door and did not breathe, because I understood that I was watching the thing the whole uniform exists to protect. Not the gate, not the gravel, this. Two soldiers, across the years, refusing to let honor be laughed out of the world. "You didn't have to come across that square," Thomas Wind said at last, lowering his hand. "Yes, I did," said Kestrel Hale. "You held the ridge. Someone has to hold the square." They sat then, the two of them, and someone brought tea, and I left them to it, because some conversations are not for corporals to overhear. That is very nearly the end of it, but not quite, because you will want to know how it landed, and it landed better than I dared hope. The long video, the true one, went everywhere. By the next morning it had overtaken the lie and buried it. The country that Thomas Wind thought had forgotten the ridge looked, for a day or two, exactly like a country that remembered, and remembered fiercely. An old soldier mocked on a bench, and a great soldier crossing a square without hurry to stand between him and the cruelty, and a salute given on cold stone. Men who had not thought about the guard in years wrote to say they had wept at it. The Veterans' Hall on the square, which had been quietly starving for funds, found itself suddenly and lavishly supported, and Fabian Denning served his year there, and I am told, I do not fully believe it, but I am told, that he came out of that year a different creature than he went in, that something in the long, slow company of old soldiers wore the sneer off him the way water wears stone, and that on the last day of his service he asked Thomas Wind, quietly, to teach him how to polish a metal properly, and the old man did. Lord Denning resigned his seat on the committee, as he was told to. The budget of the King's Guard, freed from a man who had tried to break it against a good soldier, was set that year by people who had watched the long video, and it was, for once, generous. And Sergeant Major Kestrel Hale went back to his lighter duties and his tea and his quiet crossings of Marrowgate Square, and he never spoke of any of it, because that was his way. But something had changed in his crossings. Because now most mornings there were two gray coats on the third bench along the railing, Thomas Wind, and Kestrel Hale beside him, in his off-duty dark, the two of them watching the young guard march pass through the far railing, saying little, keeping each other company in the last stretch of their long service to a country that had, for one bright morning, remembered to be worth it. Thomas Wind lived another 3 years. He came to the square every morning that his body allowed, slower and slower, and every morning Hale came and sat with him, and on the mornings the drums came they both straightened their backs by an inch that cost them a great deal, and held it until the last man had passed. When the old soldier died at last, quietly in the almshouse off the square, it was Kestrel Hale who carried his 3 medals on a cushion at the funeral, and it was the King's Guard who bore him, a private of the line, retired, whom 3 boys had once thought a thing to laugh at, and half the city came out into the streets to see him pass, because they had learned his name, and the name of the ridge, from a video that a foolish young man had made to mock him, and that had, in the end, made him immortal. I stood the west gate that day, and I could not leave my post to follow the procession, because a sentry does not leave his post. but I turned my eyes as far as the discipline of the uniform allows, and I watched the cortege cross Marrowgate Square, past the third bench along the railing, and as it passed the bench I brought my hand up in the small way you can when no order has been given and none is needed, and I held it, and I thought, there goes a man who held a ridge, buried by a country that almost forgot him, saved from being laughed out of memory by one soldier who would not hurry and would not look away. People ask me sometimes when they learn I was there, what justice looked like that morning, whether it was the lock on the flagstones, or the committee unmade, or the Lord brought down, or the boys set to their year of penance among the men they had mocked. And I tell them it was none of those or all of them, but that the truest justice arrived earlier and quieter than any of it, in the first 10 seconds, before a single official reached the square. It arrived when one soldier saw another soldier being made small, and crossed a public square without hurry, and did not weigh whether it was his business, and did not calculate the cost to himself, and stood between an old man and the cruelty of the world, and said one word: "Stop." Everything after that, the videos, the committee, the princess, the verdict, was only the machinery of the country catching up to what was already true the moment Kestrel Hale changed his course by 10 degrees. Justice did not arrive with the watch. It arrived on foot, in a plain dark coat, at a flat and even and unhurried pace, and it knelt on cold stone to set a metal straight, and it saluted a private of the line in front of 30 strangers and 3 shamed boys, and the whole in different mourning. I have stood the West Gate many years now, and I have learned the lesson that old man and that sergeant major taught the square between them, and it is this: that discipline is not the same thing as silence. The uniform teaches you to be still, to endure the fool, to hold your post while the honest impulse dies at its edge, and that is right, and that is necessary, and I would give my life to keep the gate. But there is a moment in every good soldier's life when the stillness becomes complicity, when to hold your post 1 second longer is to let honor be laughed out of the world. And the whole of your training, all those cold, motionless hours, is only the price you pay in advance to be certain, dead certain, that when that moment comes, you will know it, and you will move, and you will be right. Kestrel Hale knew it. He was right. And an old soldier who thought the country had forgotten him died 3 years later, carried by the King's Guard through streets lined with people who had learned, just in time, to remember. That is what justice looked like, that morning in Marrowgate Square. It looked like a man who would not hurry, and would not look away, and would not let an old soldier stand alone. It looked like stop asterisk.